The Buddha said not to define nirvana. Nirvana is to be realized, not to be understood. And any definition would be incorrect and lead to misunderstanding. However, even so, nirvana clearly has at least one definition, which is extinction. The Buddha often described nirvana with the analogy of a fire fueled by wood. When the wood burns out, the fire extinguishes, ceases. We should not ask where the flame goes or what it becomes after the fuel is consumed. That flame is completely extinguished, leaving nothing behind. It is total cessation. On the other hand, nirvana is often regarded as liberation from all suffering and, at the same time, as a state of ultimate and eternal bliss. Thus, liberation and bliss are also two essential meanings of nirvana. Among these three meanings, cessation remains the most mysterious and difficult to comprehend. Why is cessation considered bliss and liberation? To resolve this question, we need to thoroughly understand all the meanings of pleasure and pain, from the physical world to the spiritual realm. Below are some preliminary observations to inspire deeper exploration. The nature or essence of sentient life is to seek pleasure and avoid pain. The fundamental nature of sentient beings in general, and of humans in particular, is always to find every possible way to achieve happiness and avoid all discomfort or dissatisfaction. Everyone fears suffering, fears anything that disturbs the mind, fears illness, aging, and death. And everyone desires happiness, peace, health, wealth, fame, power, and the opportunity to enjoy these things endlessly. Why is there constant development in life? Why do humans ceaselessly seek, create, and strive? Clearly, it is to elevate their quality of life. Elevating life simply means making it more pleasurable and reducing suffering, creating peace and reducing anxiety and fear. Even crimes or wars, in truth, are often efforts to achieve personal happiness or to eliminate some source of worry or fear. Humans create all sorts of things, both good and bad, whether to help others or harm others, ultimately to satisfy their own desires. When these desires are fulfilled, people feel happiness. Even the smallest physical movement or mental intention is often aimed at avoiding discomfort and seeking pleasure. For instance, when sitting too long causes our legs to go numb, we move or stretch to feel more comfortable. When the mind becomes tense from overwork, we turn our attention to something else, such as entertainment, to feel mentally at ease. In short, to be sentient means to live. And to live means to actively avoid suffering and seek happiness. The meaning of pleasure for sentient beings. Pleasure and suffering are both sensations, which are referred to as feeling in Buddhist teachings. According to Buddhism, feelings are generally categorized into three types, and if further divided into physical and mental dimensions, there are 6 types in total. The 3 physical types are pain, pleasure, and neither pain nor pleasure. The 3 mental types are worry, joy, and neither worry nor joy. The natural essence of feeling is inherently a state of neither pain nor pleasure. As explained in the Abhidharmakosa Bhasaya, the natural function of feeling is simply receiving or absorbing. This means that feelings act as the initial gateway to receive external phenomena into the mind. At this stage, feelings merely absorb and do not yet distinguish between pleasure or pain. So how do these feelings become pleasure or pain? In Buddhist teachings, the mind is divided into 4 components: feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Among these, feeling and perception serve as tools to convey external objects into the mind, while consciousness acts as the agent that recognizes these objects. Apart from these functions, feeling, perception, and consciousness are entirely passive toward the objects. What about the objects themselves? Are they repulsive or lovable? Desirable or frightening? These characteristics are determined by the constructive activity of mental formations. The transformation of feelings into true pleasure or pain is entirely the result of the function of mental formations. What are mental formations? All activities of the mind. All attitudes of the mind toward external objects, apart from feeling, perception, and consciousness, are collectively referred to as mental formations. In essence, mental formations are the mind's creative and constructive activities. They assign names and meanings to all things, generate judgments and evaluations regarding the values and qualities of everything, and ignite the activities of body, speech, and thought. Mental formations are the driving force of the mind, the active energy of life itself. They are often referred to in Buddhist teachings as volition, which generally means intention or will. It is through volition that pleasure is created. Why is this so? Because the mind only becomes active, or more precisely, it only exerts effort when it desires or craves some desirable object. At that moment, it generates a will to possess or acquire that object. Once the object is attained, the mind experiences satisfaction, meaning a feeling of contentment or fulfillment arises. This feeling of contentment or fulfillment is precisely the meaning of pleasure and happiness for all sentient beings. If the mind has no desire, no longing, or no aspiration, it may still experience a minimal sensation of neither pleasure nor pain. However, such a state would often be perceived as lacking any real feeling, simply because it does not create any emotional states of joy or suffering. This demonstrates that desire is what generates pleasure. The meaning of suffering for sentient beings. Another point that further clarifies this meaning is that when desires are unfulfilled, the mind feels disappointment and sorrow, meaning it experiences suffering. When defining suffering, Buddhist teachings often present four aspects: being separated from loved ones, being forced to associate with those one hates, longing for something but not achieving it, and having to carry the burden of a living body and mind. The first two aspects, fundamentally, are no different from the third. When people love each other, they always desire to be together. When separated, their longing is unfulfilled, and thus they feel suffering. The same applies to those who hate each other. Hatred naturally comes with the desire to avoid one another. When forced into proximity, the desire for separation is not realized, and thus suffering arises. Even the fourth aspect does not fall outside the meaning of suffering from unfulfilled desire. Why is that? All the things that the mind fears and dislikes, such as aging, illness, death, mental anguish, anxiety, etc., originate from this body and mind. The mind desires eternal youth, freedom from illness, immortality, freedom from anxiety, and freedom from mental affliction. Yet, once burdened with such a body and mind, it is certain that these desires will never be fulfilled. Thus, having a body and mind inherently entails suffering. Even other meanings of suffering, such as impermanence and disintegration and decay, arise because these phenomena contradict the desire for permanence and eternity. In summary, all meanings of suffering are based on the concept of unfulfilled desires or dissatisfaction. Conversely, this proves that fulfillment and satisfaction equate to pleasure. Morality, a deeper dimension of the meaning of pleasure and suffering. Desires, cravings, and aspirations are the roots of both pleasure and suffering. Sentient beings live to attain happiness, which means to achieve satisfaction and fulfillment of desires. Because living is about fulfilling desires, it also means avoiding anything that goes against those desires. That is, avoiding suffering at all costs. If we examine this further, we will see that desire is an activity of the mind. To desire is always to want something, to seek a connection with the desired object through one of two activities, either benefiting or harming that object. For example, if we want to give alms, we desire for our body to take the action of offering money or possessions, and we want to benefit the recipient of the alms. Conversely, if we want to take a life, we desire for our body to take the action of killing, and we want to harm the life of someone else. At this point, We can clearly understand the meaning of worldly pleasure and suffering based on desire as follows. If we desire to give alms and successfully do so, our desire is fulfilled, and we feel satisfaction and happiness. Similarly, if we desire to kill someone and succeed, our desire is fulfilled, and we feel a sense of satisfaction. However, if we fail, if we are unable to give alms or fail to kill someone, we feel disappointed, frustrated, and upset, which is suffering. Through the above meanings and examples, it becomes evident that there is something problematic in this worldly concept of pleasure and suffering. If pleasure is merely the fulfillment of desire, then pleasure is far from being ideal. It can even be very dangerous. This is because people may commit evil acts to fulfill a desire, even if that desire appears to be good. Similarly, people may have very wicked desires, which drive them to commit harmful actions to achieve fulfillment. For example, someone who desires to kill may feel immense satisfaction if they succeed, but afterward, they will face the consequences of their wrongdoing, such as imprisonment and immense suffering. Because desire is always about wanting pleasure and avoiding suffering, this desire for happiness and freedom from suffering will compel the mind to carefully deliberate and weigh the consequences. It is not always the case that one can act on every desire immediately. In some cases, one must suppress their desires, even if doing so causes discomfort and suffering in the present. This is done to avoid even greater suffering in the future. Morality in its negative sense, avoiding suffering. It is precisely from this dynamic of patience, endurance, and self-restraint that worldly morality arises. Morality, a positive meaning of pleasure. Regardless, the meaning of pleasure and suffering remains unchanged. Achieving one's desires brings pleasure, while not achieving them brings suffering. However, if the nature of a desire is bad or evil, even if fulfilled, the resulting pleasure will still be fraught with worry and fear. Consequently, such pleasure loses its true meaning and, in reality, is entirely suffering. Therefore, to avoid suffering and achieve true pleasure, our desires must be of a virtuous and good nature. Worldly morality and ethics aim to teach us this. Furthermore, even when we have virtuous desires, we are not allowed to commit immoral acts to satisfy them, such as stealing in order to give alms. Morality and ethics do not permit this. At this point, we clearly see that our desires are subject to the intervention of morality and ethics. Throughout life, we are often compelled to suppress and control our desires according to the commands of morality and ethics. As a result, our desires may never be fulfilled in their entirety. A life without fulfillment, is it not, then, a life full of suffering? This is especially true when morality and ethics become rigid traditions of prohibition, transforming into dogmatic rules that weigh heavily on the desires of humanity. Life is driven by the energy of desire, and happiness comes from the fulfillment of desire. But now, this energy of life and sense of happiness is entirely suppressed by the heavy-handed traditions of morality and ethics. What is the purpose of this? Sometimes, no one can even provide a clear answer, and this leads to discontent and rebellion within the desires and life forces of sentient beings. In truth, morality and ethics are neither inherently dogmatic nor oppressive in a barbaric or irrational way. As mentioned earlier, their purpose is to avoid suffering for humanity. Indeed, morality and ethics are not intended to satisfy desires. On the contrary, they are rules specifically designed to regulate desires and the actions stemming from them. They do not directly bring happiness through fulfilling desires but are entirely positive in the sense of preventing suffering. Because human desires are often not virtuous, they can easily lead to reckless actions, resulting in suffering later. To prevent this suffering, morality and ethics are applied. Therefore, rather than opposing morality and ethics, people should instead blame their own bad desires. However, another extremely delicate and challenging issue arises. We often use morality and ethics as a tool of authoritarian tradition to impose our desires on others. For example, parents may use the moral principle of filial piety to coerce their children into following their wishes. In truth, Morality and ethics are principles meant to beautify the human spirit. Their purpose is to help individuals avoid suffering or to protect them from it. They are intended for personal application, not as tools to make life difficult for others. But human nature is full of emotions, love, hatred, and judgments of right and wrong, combined with a rigid and selfish ego. As a result, people often fail to apply morality and ethics in their true spirit. Instead, morality and ethics are frequently misused to cause suffering to one another. Wherever hatred exists, morality and ethics are often used as tools to slander and harm others. Morality and ethics thus become dangerous and cruel weapons. This is a complete distortion. Morality in a positive sense, experiencing pleasure. When we re-evaluate it correctly, we see clearly that morality and ethics are means to avoid suffering at its root. From the perspective of morality, the root of suffering is no longer unfulfilled desires but rather bad or evil desires. Over time, morality and ethics have become disciplines that curb these harmful desires and actions. Those who follow these disciplines are considered good, moral individuals and are praised by others. Morality and ethics provide the reward of noble good reputation, which compensates for the suffering endured when suppressing one's desires. Thus, while in their essence, morality and ethics do not positively mean pleasure through fulfilling desires, they still mean avoiding suffering. However, human nature is to actively seek happiness through the fulfillment of desires. Therefore, moralists take the suppression of evil desires as their own desire, and they take the maintenance of morality and ethics as their personal aspiration. Thus, when they successfully practice morality and maintain ethical principles, moralists feel that their aspiration is fulfilled and experience a form of positive happiness. Ultimately, morality and ethics are still about avoiding suffering and attaining happiness by finding fulfillment in virtuous desires.